Hello, everybody. My name is Cesar Reyes, and this is CRB Nexus Connect, a California State Library series. I got to sit down with Tom Nosewicz. He is the legal director for the California Committee on Revision of the Penal Code, a state entity established in 2020 to make recommendations to rationalize and simplify California's criminal law. He was previously a public defender in New York City and New Orleans, a staff attorney at the Prison Law Office in Berkeley, California, and a law clerk for the Honorable Victor Marrero of the Southern District of New York. He is a graduate of Stanford Law School and UC Berkeley. Tom, thanks for being with me today. I really appreciate you being willing to do this.
It's my pleasure. And who doesn't want to, talk about themselves for half an hour or whatever? So happy to be here.
yeah, perfect opportunity, eh? So let's start off with this. Can you tell us a little bit about your current role as it relates to the California State Legislature, and including any overview of some of your duties and sharing what you find exciting or kind of challenging about the job?
So I'm a legal director for a little state agency, as we say, called the Committee on Revision of the Penal Code, which was created by the legislature around 4.5 years ago. It came into existence in 2020, and we were created to make recommendations both to the legislature and the governor, and I think any other policymakers who are relevant to what we look at about anything having to do with criminal law and criminal procedure in the state of California. So we are an agency that makes recommendations that feed directly into the legislative process, which we've been doing for a few years, and we have a number of bills that have resulted from our recommendations. So we exist as sort of an advisory body for the legislature and the governor. And it's a super exciting, though stressful job because, I was a criminal law practitioner before I had this job, in California and a few other places across the country. And it was really exciting and daunting at the same time to be in a position to sort of think deeply about policy and try to lead a team that makes recommendations to the committee that then makes recommendations to the legislature about how California should approach some of these issues differently. California is both a leader in a lot of these issues, especially recently, but we also have a lot of work to do, and we still have very serious problems in our prisons and jails and how crime victims are treated in court. Sort of everywhere you look, there's a lot of progress to be made. So that's both exciting, but also daunting and depressing in a way, given how important these issues are to people. So that's a little bit of what the committee is, sort of the exciting parts. But my duties as legal director are to lead the staff for the Penal Code Committee, which is very small. It's me and two other people. We're all attorneys. And so we do a tremendous amount of research and analysis and writing and interfacing with the legislature and other folks who sort of could benefit from the research and the analysis that we're able to do. So to make it a little more concrete, the Penal Code Committee works with public meetings that we have every few months. And so my team, we get together the research on the topic that we're going to look at that meeting. We find witnesses to speak to the committee, and then we sort of do everything to get the meeting together. And then there's a tremendous amount of background work to do that, as anyone who sort of put on public events knows. And then we also do follow up from that based on what the committee says. And our big work product every year is an annual report that comes out in December of every year. But along the way, we do memos with background material. And we also provide regular updates on crime statistics and other data that I think is relevant to anyone thinking about these issues. And then we also work to get our recommendations into bills and work with legislators and their staff and all the different committees that a bill has to go through in the legislature to get a bill done. So we really work at all parts of the process, from conception to refining to legislation. And then we try to do follow up on implementation on the legislation as well, which is often a missing piece to this. And along the way, we talk to researchers, which I know we'll talk a little bit more about, practitioners, policymakers, impacted people, and we really try to be at the center of all those things to make sure everybody is sort of literally speaking the same language, as I always say. Are we using the same words to talk about the same stuff? always a good starting point.
Yeah.
And then B, just to make sure people sort of know what the most up to date findings or thoughts are from all these places, because there's a big disconnect, which is, I suspect, something we'll talk about later, between practice and research and policy. So we sort of sit at the middle of all that and try to bring all those things together and make work product that, you can sort of pick up if you're interested and learn a lot about the law and the data and what's going on and ways we might be able to make these things better.
That is super fascinating. I mean, you are really in like the making of the whole process. Like you are in the trenches. You are doing every little single bit and involved in all the kind of the pieces of the pie. I'm curious, how did you find yourself as the legal director?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say too, we are involved in all those pieces, but we are a small part of
Yeah.
all those things. As I learned early on when I took this job, there's no small bill in the legislature. So to do anything takes a lot of work and consensus from a lot of people who don't get a lot of credit.
Mm.
So it's we I always try to say we try to just be good colleagues for everyone and be as helpful as we can. If someone has a question, we try to answer it and provide whatever information we can. So it's great to see how government works, actually. As you get
Yeah.
closer, I think you see a lot of the problems with it. But for me, it's been a lot of people working in good faith to solve really hard issues who all have too much work to do
Always.
most of the time. I mean, there is a lot of, grandstanding and politicking as well. But, you know, it's actually is pretty great to see up close. But that was not your question. So I just wanted to make sure I put that in there.
Of course.
But
Yeah.
so the question sort of about my background. So yeah, I went to law school and I graduated knowing I wanted to be a public defender.
Mm.
And I was able to do that in a couple of different places. So I've never had my own practice or worked for a law firm or anything like that. I've always been sort of a public interest attorney and a government employed one, essentially
Yeah.
my whole career. So I was a public defender in New Orleans for a little while, where I grew up. Then I was a law clerk to a federal judge in New York City, and then I was a public defender in New York. Then I
Wow.
was able to move back to California, and I worked at somewhere called the Prison Law Office, which I should actually amend my answer. That is that's a nonprofit law firm. So I not quite an employee of the government, but the type of work we were doing was monitoring mostly prison conditions. So it was sort of a very similar function. But so I was always a practitioner and advocate. And when the Penal Code Committee was created, I knew that the person who had been appointed chair of the committee, because he had been one of my teachers in law school back in the day.
Oh, wow.
And I had stayed in touch with him, and he's been a great mentor. And I said, this sounds like a really interesting opportunity. I'd like to try to be involved. And he said, sure, but it's a civil service job, so you have to jump through, all those appropriate hoops. So I applied and was able to become the first staff member devoted exclusively to the Penal Code Committee. And then we've been able to grow a little bit from there, thanks to generous support from the legislature and the governor in the last few years.
Wow.
So, when I went to law school and finished law school, I just saw myself as a traditional sort of litigator, which is, what law schools are very mostly what they pump out, for better or for worse. I didn't really know what a policy job was or think I would sort of be a good fit for one. But especially being a public defender for, more than a decade, roughly, you start to see that you can make a big difference in individual cases, but you are a cog in the machine. And often you're a cog that makes the machine look good. Like you've had very dedicated public defenders. So, it makes the system, I think, look defensible. Like, look, you've got these really great lawyers. You couldn't hire a better lawyer a lot of the time than some of the folks that you'll get from a public defender's office. So what do we have to complain about? But the reality is there's so many systemic structural problems that even if you have the best lawyers in the world, they are not really going to be able to overcome those problems. So I think a lot of people naturally start to get a little burned out. You start to think about, this is a hopeless system we're in. It's not really helping anyone. It's not helping public safety a lot of the time. It's leaving crime victims, I think, very unsatisfied a lot of the time. And trying to take a bigger picture is sort of, I think, you can kind of go in two directions. You kind of be like, enough of this,
Right.
or are there bigger picture ways to solve it? But of course, what I miss in this job is having individual clients and sort of dealing directly on a regular basis with the people that the law is sort of impacting.
I can imagine. But I mean, you're doing good work, and it sounds like there's clear passion behind the work that you're involved in now. And I'm curious. So going back to the committee, the revision of the penal code. So it sounds like when you first started, it was just you, and and it kind of was built in from there. Can you talk a little bit about those beginning years, where it was just you doing the work?
Yes. And, the committee I started January, I don't know, 29th or something like that of 2020. A little did we know
Oh
what was
wow.
sort of coming.
Yeah. What was gonna happen?
Yeah. But so I was the first full-time staff member, but the way, and this is very, wonky inside baseball to a degree,
Hmm.
the Penal Code Committee was created as an extension in a way of something called the California Law Revision Commission that has existed for a long time, since at least the 1950s. But their mission is to look at changes to civil law. And for the most part, though it started to change a little bit recently with some of their work, to make sort of non-substantive changes, to make sure sort of the law is kept up to date in a way that doesn't
Hmm.
really change it, but just removes anachronisms and things like that. I mean, they do a lot of other work,
Hmm.
but that's sort of the main pitch for the Law Revision Commission. Um, the Penal Code Committee is quite different. You sort of can't change the Penal Code without it being controversial to a degree.
Yeah.
And the way the statute was written was clear that it should change things at the core of the system, like sentence length and anything having to do with criminal procedure. But so we were created as we were sort of, if you look at the statute, it's written in a kind of funky way. It says within the Law Revision Commission exists the Committee on Revision of the Penal Code. But what that meant from a staffing perspective was they had existing staff. I was hired to do the Penal Code Committee work, but we were
Mm.
able to sort of as a startup rely on their, all the administrative infrastructure they had and a lot of the work they had done about, here's how you set up a public meeting, here's what needs to happen. It was invaluable to have support from those folks. But as we got underway, and especially as COVID happened, and a lot of that's, we had to sort of reinvent a lot of the just logistical things of how the committee was going to work. Some of that changed. And then we were able to hire, another staff counsel within that first year, and then another person
Oh
after that.
wow.
And we had some outside philanthropic help as well to have an additional attorney working for us through Stanford, where the chair works. So I was not by myself for very long, but
Yeah.
in those
Yeah.
initial days, there was a lot to figure out and a lot to do, and compounded by COVID happening. And we also were about to have another child. So there was I don't know how anything really got done for anyone, sort of in those days,
Yeah.
unless you were like really on the front lines. But we did it, and we're still here. So yeah, it was a really entrepreneurial sort of time to figure out how to do a lot of this stuff, which is something that I've sort of has been, I think, helpful throughout my career. Everywhere I've gone, I've sort of either ended up through intentionality or just sort of tagging along to other folks starting new projects and things like that, where I've been for the most part. So that was one of the things that attracted me to working here as well, is sort of taking this committee from almost nothing to like, how is this going to work? How are we going to be more than just a PDF report that sits on hard drives, which
Right.
so
Right.
far I've been
Yeah.
able to do a little bit.
Some of that work that you've been doing, some of the policy issues maybe you've worked on in the past. Can you talk about some of those that have come up, or certain projects that you've been on, that your team's been on?
Sure. We have looked at everything from traffic infractions to the death penalty. So we've taken a very large look.
Wow.
The Penal Code Committee's main mission is to improve public safety while also reducing unnecessary incarceration and improving equity. And I think especially racial equity, which I think everyone agrees has serious issues in our criminal legal system. Um,
Hmm.
so our first recommendation number one, our first report was about, driving on a suspended license and things like that. And then, later that year, we had a report saying that the death penalty should be repealed because it's unworkable and, has just been infected with intractable racial disparities along the way. So we sort of have looked at a lot of things, but some common things
Yeah.
we return to are extreme sentences. People who are sentenced to decades in prison,
Mm.
that seem to serve no public safety, seem to have no public safety justification. So that's a common thing we will return to. And sort of the technical process for resentencing people in certain circumstances, that's something we've come back to. The use of sentencing enhancements is something we spent a lot of time on. And more recently, last Friday, we had a meeting about the process for people who are innocent of crimes to be able to go back to court and prove that and get compensation. And earlier this year, we also looked at
Mm.
DUI, driving, while intoxicated, the law there, and ways we might be able to improve that to make road safety improve, while also having a more equitable process for the folks who are charged of those offenses. So we've
Mm.
really covered a lot of things, but always returning to that idea of how can we improve public safety while making this a fairer, more equitable process, and rely less on incarceration and only do so where it's absolutely necessary. So, I could go on, and I have to a degree, but it's quite a wide scope we've looked at, and I think part of what we try to do too is find things that don't always get the attention that perhaps they need. Like I think, and this is something we can talk about the legislative process a little
Okay.
bit. Sometimes things that get a lot of attention are
Yeah.
important, but might be sort of limited in scale, or sometimes they're just frankly not important and not something we need to be spending a lot of attention on. So what we try to do at the Penal Code Committee is find things that are sort of either a really serious injustice or problem or public safety issue, even if it only affects,
Mm.
a relatively small number of people, or these bigger issues that maybe the harm is not so deep, but it affects a lot of people. So we try to always keep those two different sort of
Mm.
scoping ideas in mind. So we try to end up having a mix of very big ideas to smaller ideas and everything in between, so that there's sort of a menu of options for the legislature and others to pick from if they're interested in any of our recommendations.
I mean, it sounds like a lot of topics or information to try to like wrap your arms around, you know? Uh, how do you go about the process of gathering that information or where do you start? Like what is your start process for working on a project?
Well, you're absolutely right. It can be quite daunting, but my team is great, and we're all pretty experienced practitioners before we came into this. So if you're a public defender, or a prosecutor, anyone who's sort of in court every day with a big caseload, I think you're used to just processing a ton of information and learning, how to do effective research and what's important and what isn't. And it's sort of a muscle you develop. And one way to do that is something that I relied on a lot in my years as a practitioner was checklists. So we have research checklists, like make sure you go to these 6 places first, that tend to have information. We talk to each other a lot, and in this job, I'm subscribed. I don't even want to know how many newsletters I'm subscribed to, but just always have information coming in. And I have a good, I use the Zotero information manager, whatever it's called, to sort of organize PDFs, and stuff is coming in. You save it for later, and you just sort of rely on that shared kind of institutional knowledge of yourself and your colleagues to know, like, oh, I remember there was a case on this, or, somebody did research on this in Connecticut 5 years ago or something like that. But that combined with sort of systematically going to certain, sources for information. And then we contact experts and other practitioners and folks pretty regularly. I mean, I think for every witness we have at a penal code committee meeting, we've probably talked to, I don't know, 5 or 6
Wow.
people. So we really do talk to dozens of people every year about these topics. And, we have certain go-to people that we talk to for certain topics, and the sort of organizations of professionals in California, like the chief probation officers of the Public Defenders Association. We'll talk to folks from those places as well. But it's really hard. It depends on the topic. There are some areas where we have to become the
Oh.
experts as staff and try to communicate, complex ideas to folks. We do cover a lot of different topics every year, and that's one of the fun things. But it also is, it keeps it interesting, but it also is like, okay, now we're gonna shift from looking at, habeas corpus to, whatever, the Racial Justice
Yeah.
Act, and those things have a little bit of overlap, especially those two in particular, but oftentimes they'll be just totally different from each other. But that's one of the things that makes the job
Yeah, I imagine
interesting.
there's always something new that you're discovering or figuring out. I'm kind of curious. So when you present your recommendations, right? Is there, what are you providing all this research? Is it like just tons of information? Like how do you present that, those key findings?
Yeah, well, so the actual recommendations, we try to keep those pretty tight and formulaic,
Okay.
honestly. There'll be 3 to 4 pages in our annual report, and they'll have like the same sections from year to year. And that is based mostly on what we've found to be the answers that I think legislators and other people in the legislature want to know when they're looking at a proposal. Like, what data is there on this? What do other states do? So we try to have like, okay, if you want to know what the data is, go to the data section for this proposal.
Mm,
But that is sort of the most refined version of the recommendation. Throughout the year, my team, we do background memos that'll be, just 20 pages on one topic, for example, with as much relevant data as we think to provide, and the law and whatever else that we think is relevant to the topic. Then we'll do a follow-up memo to that, which might have more information. So if
oh,
someone really wants to go deep on a topic, there's a lot more material there. And of course, there are the public meetings
mm,
as well, which will have, often, each meeting will have at least a dozen people at it talking about an individual topic. But we know, our work product, we want it to be immediately useful to the legislature and the governor and others. So we, have a very refined version, but that is often the tip of the iceberg for a lot of the work that's been done.
what is the witness process like? So you're interviewing people who are kind of key to or relevant to the topic area you're focused on. Like, what is that like?
That, yes, in short, that's a good way to think about it. We're trying to find people who it sort of depends on what the topic is. Like sometimes we need someone who can really
Sure.
explain something. Sometimes we need people who have a very strong recommendation to make, or sometimes we want people who can explain maybe why that recommendation isn't good or something you haven't thought about there. Sometimes we have people from the state agency who administer a program or are involved somehow, and they're sort of just there because their voice is an essential part of the process, and you can't imagine talking about a topic without
Mhm.
them. And we'll have researchers there just to talk about the research they've done that might be relevant. So it sort of is very responsive to what the topic is. This last meeting we had
Yeah.
mostly practitioners talk about the habeas corpus process, which is what you do after your conviction is sort of done in the first wave of court proceedings. And it's a very esoteric area of the law. So we really wanted people who knew it well, knew it from experience, but could also talk sort of like, a non-lawyer in a way about it. So
Yeah, the
yeah. So you're
non-jargon.
trying to like
Yeah.
it's like for casting for like a talk show or something like that sometimes. And it doesn't always work out the way we expect or
Wow.
work out well. But what the committee members find most helpful is discussion, having Q&A with the folks. So we try to find folks who can really have that discussion and won't just resort back to talking points or things that aren't really going to be responsive. So it takes a lot of work, but I think
Yeah.
it's worth it because you really do find as expert as we try to become about something, it's one of like 10 recommendations we're looking at in a year or something like that. So someone whose whole career and practice is about one thing, obviously they're going to know more than you.
Of course. Of course. If I'm new to the legislature, I'm a new staffer, right? Do you have any advice about how to do like research gathering or information gathering well, like practices that you might keep to kind of keep it easier and not so burdensome sometimes?
Well, you know, I think the secret, and it's not really a secret, is that just starting with a Google search is incredibly helpful these days. And I'm,
Yeah,
old enough to remember when that was not always the case. And just the amount of, how good that process has become. And, it's free and cheap. It's easy. And I think everyone knows how to do it. That's often where we start just because, you have a thought, you can do a query and get something back instantly, and you sort of go from there. Um, but I think the other thing is related to that are sort of the newsletters I talked about. Like, if you are interested in
Mm.
something, somebody's got some nerdy newsletter about it, or may have often many of them, and just sort of getting into that flow and sort of seeing the way things are talked about, the sort of research consensus or conclusions that are frequently referenced, I find really helpful, just to sort of get into the flow of the discourse. But then, and they're often, and especially for criminal justice and criminal legal system issues, there are a number of good, reliable think tanks out there that produce reports, and then entities like myself, who our whole job is to sort of, be a shortcut for a lot of that research. Um, but I think, that's just sort of, how do you get raw material? I think it's so important to know how to evaluate sources too, especially in this area where, a lot of things that are not true or taken out of context are repeated, and they get repeated enough, they sort of get taken as received wisdom.
Mm.
That's something I've learned over my career, is like, always go look for the sources. If someone's not showing you their sources, that tells you something. Go back to the original sources, make sure
Mm.
it's not being distorted. And if that source is just citing something else, you gotta pull the thread all the way back to the original, and make sure that what is being said
Yeah.
is reliable, because it's, all of us are, working. We don't have enough time to do things, and I think it's very easy for errors to get introduced that then just sort of get laundered and become true. And this can also be something that comes up where you realize, oh, this data everyone's citing in this report from 2024 is actually from a study done in 1997 using
Whoa.
data from 1986. And it's like, okay, might still be relevant, but it's good to know
Hmm.
this is, like 40 years old at this point. um, so that's something that you just have to sort
Yeah.
of don't trust anything until there's a reason to really rely on it. So that's something I think is important to know with research, because now it's so easy to find stuff, but what do it's not all created equal. And a lot of really smart people from reputable places, especially if they're a little bit outside of their comfort zone, like researchers talking about the law and vice versa, lawyers talking about research, you got to just be super careful there and make sure something hasn't gotten messed up along the way. And pretty frequent to see that. It doesn't mean the work is not usable, but you just sort of need to know what you can use it for.
I think that's some brilliant advice, and definitely something to keep in mind. Get to the source, find
Right.
the source, the main source, and knowing where the information's coming from.
And the
Um,
other reason to do that too is you may find stuff doing that sort of, tracing back in the original source that is more helpful than the proposition that the research or the case or whatever is often cited for. Like, don't just let other people control the way you read something. Of course, it's very time consuming, and you have to have the sort of fluency to do a lot of that. But folks develop that over time. I think you just have to know, like, okay, you can't just take it for granted unless it's from my organization. Everything we say is totally on the level and correct. So it goes for everybody else.
I mean, by how much all the information gathering you do, and the deep process you do, and the 20-page report, sometimes I can see how you're a reputable source,
Well,
you
and,
can
and,
trust.
and Caesar, if you look at our memos, half of the page is footnotes. I feel really strongly in this area. You
Wow.
have to show your work.
Mm.
And I probably go over the top, and I'm sure my team will tell you I'm way over the top on it, but I feel really strongly about that. And that's also part of legal culture as well. But I'm just shocked by how often you will see just statements made in public that just are not true, or
Mm.
wrong somehow, or have some important fact wrong. And I want our work to be a source of, you can disagree with our conclusions, but at least we're showing all our work. Here's how we got here. And
Yeah.
that's, I think a role we play, not just for our own credibility, but, as a sort of source of information for the public, as a government entity. I think it's important for us to be that way.
No, I think that's great. And I'm wondering, for new staffers, maybe for an intern, for a fellow, are you, in your own experience, have you seen any like challenges for new staff, or places that have been most rewarding maybe for new staff?
Challenges for sure, and it's something I've said a few times, is just the sort of tidal wave of information that I think is coming at people in
Mm.
the under legislature. And these conversation, a lot of conversations on these topics have been going on for a long time. There's a lot of lingo. There's a lot of things taken
Oh
for
yeah.
granted. And I think it's tough for newer people to strike the balance between like, well, it's okay to ask questions and to challenge assumptions, but you also don't want to, you know, uh, get in the way of people being able to have discussions and talk. Like, you can't ask for a primer on on every topic every time you have a meeting with someone. But it is also okay to say, well, I don't understand this, can you explain that? Because I think folks who
Mm.
are been deep on an issue just sometimes can get lost in their own world a little bit, and actually can be really helpful to have someone with a new perspective say, but why is that? Why do we do it that way? What does this acronym
Hmm.
mean? Does this make sense? So I think that's a really great benefit that folks newer to a process can bring. But you also have to have the humbleness to know, I am new and I am still learning how to do it, and it's a very hard balance to strike. But I think I always love when people ask questions, because if I can't explain it in a good way, that's a sign there's probably an issue with the proposal or something like that, or something we haven't thought of.
Can you tell us where people can kind of find some of those reports that the committee has published, especially the yearly ones that y'all put out?
Yes, we have a website that is not the most modern, cutting edge website. That's kind of how you know
Yeah,
it's legit. It
1990s.
looks like
Yeah,
a
yeah.
right. Which, is it's fine. It's we don't need to be flashy. We're not trying to get you to sign up and create an
Right.
account or anything like that, or subscribe, give us your credit card. So, it's, if you just Google committee or whatever your search engine of choice, don't mean to endorse a particular one, but using
Yeah.
it as a generic verb, the Committee on Revision of the Penal Code, California, you'll find us. But it's clrc.ca.gov/CRPC. That's why I don't like giving out the URL. And who gives
For
out
sure.
URL these days? Anyway, I'm happy to do it. But we're pretty easy to find. We've got a mailing list. It's super low volume. All you hear from us is, here's a new memo, here's a notice of the meeting. So you'll go months without hearing anything. That's a
Mm.
great way to stay in touch. And all our reports, memos are on the website. Videos of every meeting are on YouTube. So if you're having a hard time falling asleep on a long flight or something, we have got dozens of hours for you to listen to. And we also try to be very accessible to members of the public and everyone as well. So you'll find our emails on the website, and I encourage anyone to be in touch. If they just want to learn more about what we're looking at, we can point you in any direction that we can to, give you resources. Or if you think there's something the committee should look at, we're also very eager to hear about that. Because I think probably everyone in California has been a crime victim of something at some point, or knows someone who's been arrested if they themselves haven't been. So these issues, I think, are things that really touch directly on everyone, and the discourse around them is often so extreme that it's easy to, I think, not think you have a way into it or you can have a voice in it. But there's a lot to talk about, and we love hearing from folks.
Awesome. Tom, it has been wonderful talking with you. Thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure. Thank you.